Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I bring you 6 more unanswered questions slash conspiracy theories, whatever you want to call them, about Agatha Christie novels. It's actually split evenly here, 3 unanswered questions and 3 conspiracy theories. This is my 4th edition of this video, and the well of ideas for it is running a little dry, so if you have any, keep them coming. I hope to squeeze out at least one more video on this topic down the road. But there will be spoilers ahead, so you can use the chapter headings to skip ahead if you need to. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel, and to make sure to check out my advent calendar of short stories on the community page. Every day until Christmas, I will add a new holiday mystery short story to check out. And also, if I make any mistakes in a video, please don't be as shy to point them out, as some of you have. It's usually about pronunciations of things, so keep that coming. I like being corrected so I can get it right in the future. But still, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. And starting it off with an unanswered question from Cards on the Table, and that is, what crime did Mrs. Lorimer allegedly commit? Well, we do know that she murdered her husband. At least that's what she believes she was accused of. We never get any real look into her past. I mean, the other 3 suspects are all investigated, and we get an answer for their alleged murder in their past. But Mrs. Lorimer gets no such treatment. She's a total enigma on that front. She does later, towards the end of the story, tell Poirot that Shaitana believes she murdered her husband, and Poirot seems to believe this as well. Poirot almost compliments her on her cool-mindedness and who she would only commit a murder that's pre-planned, and that's why he knows she didn't kill Shaitana. So I think we can accept Poirot's belief as true, that Mrs. Lorimer did murder her first husband and that she planned it. And then I think we could also determine the method was poisoning, as Shaitana lists different murder methods at that dinner party. And we mentions 4 situations, and 3 of them belong to the other 3 suspects. So the poisoning has to be Mrs. Lorimer's. That's the one that's left over. And that would fit her personality. Other than that, everything else we can do is just pure speculation. Like, how did she do this? We don't know. And we aren't given even a morsel of a hint to work with. But we can more fully speculate why. Why did she murder her husband, if that she did indeed do? It doesn't appear because she wanted to marry someone else. Interestingly, the reason why Mrs. Lorimer tries to take the blame for Shaitana's murder is because she thinks Anne Meredith did it. She's wrong, but that's what she thinks. And she said Anne reminded her of her younger self because she was lonely. And that does open the possibility that Mrs. Lorimer was just like Anne when she was younger. So does that mean Mrs. Lorimer was also a selfish, ruthless, petty thief? We're primed to trust Mrs. Lorimer's judgment, and if Mrs. Lorimer says she was like Anne, I think we should accept that. But that doesn't really feel true, that Mrs. Lorimer was a thief, mainly because Poirot respects Mrs. Lorimer, and Poirot does not respect Anne Meredith. So what other motives could Mrs. Lorimer have? I see a theory a lot that Mr. Lorimer was an abusive husband, so Mrs. Lorimer killed him. That's possible, but there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that, although it would be the kind of murder Poirot would approve of. Poirot doesn't really push to have Mrs. Lorimer arrested for murder, or even just judge her, which, I mean, to be fair, she is terminally ill, which is likely a much bigger factor in all that. But I think a point against that is that Mrs. Lorimer dies in the end, which means she is someone who had to have justice served against her, which an abused wife would not. I think a possible theory here is that Mr. Lorimer was having an affair. And you should never assume an author is inserting her own thoughts and opinions into her characters, but one cannot help but to see a lot of similarities between Mrs. Lorimer and Agatha Christie. The calculating personalities, the preference for poisons, the protecting of the daughter/daughter-like figure. And we're told Shaitana found Mrs. Lorimer in Egypt, where Christie frequented herself. She was always in that part of the world. Christie didn't murder her cheating husband, Archie Christie, though I'm sure she wanted to. Is it really that big of a stretch to think Mrs. Lorimer murdered a cheating husband? I think not. Next up, another unanswered question, this one coming from a pretty major novel, Murder on the Orient Express, and it's the question of, who was the woman in the scarlet kimono? We don't get an answer for this, and Poirot says he thinks it was Countess Andreni. Far be it from me to disagree with Poirot, but I do disagree with Poirot. I don't think it was Countess Andreni. As a refresher, Countess Andreni is one of the passengers. She's, in fact, the only passenger not named Poirot in the Calais coach not to stab Cassetti. The reason for this was because her connection to the Armstrongs was so strong that she was sort of like the obvious suspect. So, in order to protect her, her husband took her place among the jurors. It doesn't make any sense to me then why part of the plan would then involve having the Countess Andreni parade around in a scarlet kimono, knock on Poirot's door, and risk getting seen by him. It doesn't make any sense if part of the plan was to make sure that she could not be incriminated in any way. Why have her contribute to the plan? And to be honest, she probably shouldn't have even been on the train in the first place. Considering her mother is also on the train and a resemblance may have been made. I personally think Mary Debenham is a much better candidate for Our Lady in the Scarlet Kimono. I think, one, the woman in the Scarlet Kimono was created purely as a distraction for Poirot. He was meant to see her and obsess over her. And that kimono is found in Poirot's luggage. Poirot takes this very personally, as the perpetrator is now toying and teasing him. It's very clear Mary Debenham hates Poirot. The others resent his presence, for sure, but Mary Debenham really hates him because he pries a lot into her and asks her a lot of personal questions. What better person to be this tormentor of Poirot than Mary Debenham? Only she would think to hide the kimono in his suitcase, and I think just some more evidence against being Countess Andreni is that she was supposed to have taken a sleeping medication, and while that could have been a lie, I actually think she really did do that to keep her out of the situation. I mean, that would just make a lot of sense. And I think crucially here, we have evidence from Count Andreni. He swears on his honor that his wife did not leave her compartment the night of the murder. And the importance of a man like Count Andreni swearing on his honor is sort of lost nowadays, but the truth of it is, in 1934, if a man like Count Andreni swore on his honor his wife never left her cabin, then she didn't leave her cabin. His honor is extremely important to him, and Poirot also accepts this. If you've read Dorothy Sayers' Lord Peter Wimsey novel Clouds of Witness, you'll see that Lord Peter's brother, the Duke of Denver, nearly gets himself executed because he won't break his word of honor. That's how important it is. Now, I think the only piece of favor in favor of it being Countess Andreni is that she's the most likely woman to own that scarlet kimono. I mean, the whole woman in the kimono thing was not planned ahead of time. That was only created because Poirot was suddenly on the train. So the passengers had to improvise that, but I don't think that's a particularly strong piece of evidence. I'm inserting this next bit here after I recorded because I realized something that I had made a mistake. In Murder on the Orient Express, Poirot doesn't actually say Countess Andreni was the girl in the scarlet kimono. He does point out that the scarlet kimono is probably hers because she doesn't have like a robe or anything else in her luggage. All the other women did when the luggage was searched. But the implication here is still that, first of all, we don't know who the woman in the scarlet kimono is, and second, that Poirot still sort of does imply that it's her, though it's a lot less clear than I had remembered, which is odd because I had just read Murder on the Orient Express for video in 2 weeks. I'll be reviewing that. So I just wanted to clarify that mistake here, but I still think largely what I said remains true. It's just that Poirot is less clear in his assertion that Countess Andreni is the girl in the scarlet kimono than I had originally stated. And also, he does mention that Count Andreni's honor, that he believes that she never left her cabin that night. So again, it's still, the theory still stands, the unanswered question still stands that who is this woman? But again, it is less clear that Poirot says it's Countess Andreni than I had remembered it was. Another unanswered question comes to us from The Moving Finger, and that is, how did Jerry Burton get injured? If you remember the setup to this novel, it's that Jerry and his sister Joanna temporarily moved to Limstock so Jerry can recuperate from his injuries. We never get any true explanation as to what happened to Jerry. It's assumed widely actually that he was injured during the war. It's 1942. We know he was a pilot. And he opens up the novel by saying he experienced a small crash while landing his plane. However, he never says at any point that it happened because of the war. And it also seems like this crash happened like somewhat locally to where Jerry lived. It doesn't seem like it happened on the continent. And I don't necessarily think Jerry is a reliable narrator when it comes to talking about himself. I think he's reliable relating the events of the story. But I have this theory here that Jerry was drunk while flying the plane and crashed it. And this is sort of closer to what the ITV Geraldine McEwen version portrays. I think in that one he was like riding a motorcycle while drinking. I think Jerry is very clearly in the mold of this sort of like wild young man we see a lot in Christie, often depicted as a communist, but really this undesirable rogue figure, who is at heart a good person, but is currently a jerk as he sows his wild oats. That's Jerry. And interestingly, we get a lot of things like Jerry saying like, "Oh, he was told to go to the country to heal his injuries," but he's also talks a lot about how he's going to the country for peace of mind, as if there's like some other underlying issue going on he wants to get away from. Limstock is not London. It's not a big flashy city with lots to do. It's a place to go to rest one's mind and soul in addition to the injuries, which by the time he and Joanne arrive in Limstock don't really seem to be hindering him all that much. I mean, he was in the hospital for a long time already. It's actually a very Inspector Grant and Daughter of Time in the way he's bored, but when you're able to move around and bored, you don't go to Limstock to not be bored. At least normally without all the letter stuff going on, but Limstock is a place to go when you don't want to drink. And yeah, I am reading a lot into this, but the point remains is that we never get any real explanation as to why Jerry crashed his plane, if that is indeed what happened. And knowing Christie and the type of young men she creates, very good chance Jerry did something like unsavory, like fly a plane after he drank. And there also seems to be this like unspoken sort of connection between Jerry and Dr. Griffith, as if Dr. Griffith knows something about Jerry he's not saying. And you also have like Joanna being very overprotective of Jerry, at least initially. However, she's not really like concerned about Jerry's physical injury. She never tells him to like stay in bed or whatever. There's definitely like something else going on here with Jerry, but that we can only speculate, as I just did. This next one is a conspiracy theory. I mean, not really. It's sort of a mix of conspiracy and unanswered question. And this is also a request I was asked to cover for multiple of you. And I see this question a lot, and that is from Toward Zero. Did Neville Strange murder Adrian Royce? With the common assumption that, yeah, Neville did. And just to refresh everyone here, Neville was married to Audrey Strange, who divorced Neville to marry Adrian. However, Adrian died in a car accident soon afterwards, and both Superintendent Battle and Adrian's brother Thomas at least consider the likelihood that Neville had murdered Adrian so Audrey would return to him. Unfortunately, we don't get a lot of information on this car accident that Adrian died in. It barely gets mentioned, so I don't really have much of anything to speculate on here. It's not really discussed in the book, and no details are given. However, I think it is at least somewhat likely. I mean, given that we know Neville is an unscrupulous psychopath who will do anything to get Audrey back, I definitely think a plan to murder Adrian at least came to his mind. Now, I think murdering someone with your car intentionally is very different from the murder plan Neville came up with when he killed Lady Tressilian. They don't necessarily jive well, so I think that is a point against him, but I mean, that's a minor one. And to be fair, I mean, we know Neville murdered before when he was a child. He murdered Mr. Treves, and these were all very different styles of murder plans. What really bothers Neville is that Audrey left him, which bruised his ego. That fragile masculinity he possesses is quite deadly. And I wish I had more to say. I received this quest a lot. It's probably my most asked request, but there just isn't a whole lot to go on here. I mean, Battle voices his opinion that Neville killed Adrian. He doesn't know that, though, but I think we're supposed to accept what Battle says as fact. So I do lean toward Neville having killed Adrian. There's a logical reason for him to do so. The motivation and method are consistent with Neville's personality. I wish I could provide a more detailed analysis, but I mean, the material just isn't in the book for me to do so. This next conspiracy theory is one I first heard about on the All About Agatha podcast, and I have seen it repeated all over the place from the likes of Reddit to elsewhere, so I thought it was worth discussing, and then involves two novels, really three in a short story, but really mostly two. One of these books I already talked about in this video, and that is Bunch Harmon from A Murder is Announced, the daughter of the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop from The Moving Finger, who also appear in The Pale Horse. And there is some suggestions that this may be the case. In The Moving Finger, we are told the Dane Calthrops have adult children. We're actually told the Dane Calthrops are celibate at one point, but I assumed we were not supposed to take that literally. Like, I think because they're older, I think that's what we're supposed to be meant by that. And in A Murder is Announced, Miss Marple says that Bunch is her goddaughter and that her father used to be vicar in St. Mary Mead, presumably before Leonard Clement, while Bunch's mother is smart, intelligent, and imposing. That sounds a lot like Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop, although we are never told Reverend Dane Calthrop was ever vicar of St. Mary Mead. Although he would be vicar in Much Deeping in The Pale Horse, so it's possible he moved around a lot. Bunch is married to a vicar herself, Julian, vicar of Chipping Cleghorn. So, with all these possible connections, it might be surprising to you that I'm going to say that I don't think Bunch is the daughter of the Dane Calthrops. For one, Bunch's personality is totally unlike either of her parents. And while that's hardly evidence, I don't really see much proof she has anything in common with her alleged parents. And we know the Reverend Dane Calthrop was a man obsessed with his books and intellectual matters, and his wife is also very intelligent and shrewd. People were afraid of her. Bunch is not intellectual. She's very naive and she's overly friendly, and no one is afraid of her. And she herself isn't exactly like a shrewd personality. And we were told she was like too afraid to even pay attention during the holdup. Like she closed her eyes like a child. She lacked the sort of like social awareness the Dane Calthrops had. When she walks into Little Paddocks, she outright mentions the murder, which was something everyone else was trying to avoid. The Dane Calthrops feel like the kind of parents whose children wouldn't be like Bunch. Again, that's not really like evidence, but still, I don't see like a personality connection between Bunch and the Dane Calthrops. And the final piece of evidence against this theory is that Limstock is explicitly stated to be the hometown of the Dane Calthrops, which I would take to mean that they were born and raised there. So not St. Mary Mead. I guess it's still possible that the Reverend could have been vicar in St. Mary Mead for a time. And there's also like other small pieces. I mean, when Miss Marple goes to Limstock, it's mentioned she's an old friend of Mrs. Dane Calthrop, and nothing is ever said about her, her being like a godmother to one of their children. If Bunch were the Dane Calthrop's daughter, I also think Christie would have just outright said that in A Murder is Announced, or Sanctuary, which is the short story Bunch appears in, but she doesn't. And Christie often mentions connections between characters from different books. Like we have like Julia Upjohn knew Mrs. Summerhays, and Mrs. Lytton Gore, and Meredith Blake, and etc., etc. No reason for Christie to be hiding this. It's not like a secret clue or anything. And the final conspiracy theory comes to us from Curtin, Poirot's final novel, and it's this theory that Norton essentially committed suicide by cop. And I think I also first heard this theory on the All About Agatha podcast, but I've seen it many places, other places as well. The idea here is that Norton recognizes he is so depraved and can't help himself that he decides to end it all by going to Styles and manipulating Poirot into killing him and putting him out of his misery. Norton intentionally sought Poirot out so Poirot would end it. And I strongly disagree with this theory. I do believe for sure that Norton intentionally manipulated Poirot into killing him. That's sort of, his greatest move. I don't doubt that. I actually think that's pretty genius, but I disagree with the notion that Norton recognized himself as a monster and wanted Poirot to kill him to end it all. First of all, Norton could have just killed himself if that were the case. Second, Norton never shows any remorse for his actions. He never shows any restraint or hesitation. In fact, he tries multiple times in Curtin to get other people murdered. He tries with the Luttrells, he tries with Hastings and Major Allerton. He succeeds with Mrs. Franklin, although she winds up accidentally killing herself. Norton tries to frame Judith and Dr. Franklin for that murder. He also apparently was trying something with Nurse Craven and Major Allerton. Those are not the actions of a man who is unhappy with himself. Moreover, we know Poirot sought out Norton, not the other way around, which is why this theory would need to happen to be true. Poirot made plans. He got rid of Georges and hired Curtis because Georges knew Poirot was not disabled. I think Norton saw the opportunity when Poirot arrived at Styles and took it. He could have left, and quite frankly, probably should have. This is what I speculated when I discussed if Miss Marple could have solved Curtin. I wondered if Norton would have even have tried his act if Miss Marple was around, with her being a less juicy target than Poirot. Norton never shows any remorse or any indication he wants to stop. In fact, he shows the exact opposite. He wants to continue and fry up these bigger fish. I think he's fine being murdered because there is no bigger fish to fry than Poirot. He manipulated Poirot. Where does he go from there? There's no greater act he can do. But he is certainly not someone who wants to die because he hates what he's doing. I don't think there's any indication of that whatsoever. And that is it for this video. Keep these conspiracies and unanswered questions coming. I want to do more videos like this. I'm also open to doing a video or two for other authors, maybe like a mix of them. I have some ideas there, but I look to do 6 per video. I only have 3 more unanswered questions for Christie on the list waiting to go, and then I have 3 for others collectively. So, just keep the ideas coming here. Next week, it is Christmas, and I will be reviewing a Christmas novel, and one that was recommended by a viewer, The Finishing Stroke by Ellery Queen. I really wanted to do this one, and I was glad someone recommended it, so I had an excuse to cover it instead of the other book I had decided to do that I didn't really want to do. Originally, my plan was for Christmas week, I would have Murder on the Orient Express, and then for the week after, I would have Miss Silver novel, The Clock Strikes 12, because that's like a New Year's theme. But instead, we're now doing The Finishing Stroke for Christmas and Murder on the Orient Express for New Year's. And Miss Silver will have to wait another day. Anyway, I highly recommend reading The Finishing Stroke. It is excellent. It is top tier Ellery Queen. 5 stars. I really can't praise it enough. So hopefully you'll read it in time for next week or whenever you decide to do so. Until next time, Mystery Files.